At 2:14 on January 30th, 2026, in international waters near the Strait of Hormuz, the thunder of an MH-60R Seahawk tore through the night sky. The helicopter held steady just 15 meters above the deck of the mysterious cargo vessel Volga Dream. With the side hatch open and the wind blasting through the cabin, 6 SEAL Team 6 operators stood ready, gloved hands wrapped around the fast rope, waiting for one word: go. The mission was clear: drop onto the deck and secure the ship before its cargo could continue on its way. U.S. intelligence believed the vessel was transporting critical technology in direct violation of the Trump administration's newest sanctions. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Then, without warning, it all went wrong. The Seahawk's electronic warfare system suddenly went dead. The pilot's HUD went black. At the same moment, the cockpit filled with urgent threat warnings. On the deck of the Volga Dream, 4 weathered cargo containers snapped open, exposing Club K launch systems already locked onto the American aircraft. But even that was not the worst part. Seconds later, technical reconnaissance from the 5th Fleet delivered a far more disturbing report. Hidden inside the ship's hull was the Merman BN Strategic Electronic Warfare System, AI 2026 variant. At its core sat a high-density radioisotope power source. In an instant, the entire Special Operations team understood the scale of the trap closing around them. If U.S. forces opened fire, armor-piercing rounds could rupture the power unit below deck and trigger a contamination catastrophe at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. But if the ship was allowed to continue and reached an Iranian port within the next 4 hours, the balance of American air dominance in the Middle East could be altered for good. So how could the Pentagon stop the vessel without igniting a wider global conflict? The answer began with a bold and almost unbelievable decision made 8 hours earlier. 8 hours before the standoff, a US KH-11 satellite captured the first images of the Volga Dream. The vessel carried no flag and transmitted no AIS signal as it moved out from deeper waters. But what analysts saw next was even more alarming. The ship was not alone. Around it, 30 Iranian-flagged fishing boats traveled in an unnaturally tight formation, sometimes less than 50 meters apart. Each one continuously broadcast civilian AIS signals, moving in chaotic patterns that created a near-perfect human shield. Any long-range precision strike now carried enormous risk. And the danger did not end there. The moment this formation crossed into international waters, the tactical displays aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln began showing unusual bands of white noise interference. What had started as a covert interception was rapidly turning into something far more dangerous, a layered, deliberate confrontation in one of the most volatile waterways on Earth. Naval intelligence soon confirmed the threat. The opposing side had activated a specialized GPS/GNSS jamming module, reportedly modeled on Pole 21 technology and covertly installed on the deck of the Volga Dream. The system instantly created an invisible 50-kilometer shield that blocked GPS signals across the area. In practical terms, that meant America's long-range precision weapons, from Tomahawk cruise missiles to guided glide bombs, could no longer be trusted to hit with accuracy. Launching into that interference zone carried a serious chance of missing the intended target and striking a civilian vessel instead. Russia and Iran were now testing Washington in plain view. Would the United States actually pull the trigger, knowing the risks could include a major civilian disaster and a ready-made excuse for a much wider conflict? If you think the U.S. can break through that shield, comment yes below. Now watch how the Admiral chose to respond. Refusing to accept the standoff, the commander of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group ordered what was known as the onion-peeling tactic. The idea was simple in theory, but risky in practice. Apply overwhelming non-lethal pressure, strip away the civilian screen layer by layer, and force the Volga Dream to stop, all without launching a missile. 2F/A-18F Super Hornet block. 3 fighters immediately broke away from an MQ-25 Stingray refueling drone at 30,000 feet. Then they dropped hard toward the sea at Mach 1.2, screaming just above the fishing fleet in a terrifying low pass. The sonic shock tore across the water, creating intense acoustic pressure meant to trigger panic and scatter the boats. At the same time, the destroyer USS Spruance surged forward to slice through the hostile formation. Its long-range acoustic device came online, followed by high-pressure water cannons, while repeated warnings demanded that the Russian-linked vessel cut its engines and prepare for inspection. Under almost every previous scenario, that improvised fishing boat screen should have collapsed under the sheer force of American military pressure. But the reality of the 2026 battlefield hit the Pentagon's doctrine like a hammer. The fishing boats did not break apart. Instead, they accelerated together, swinging their bows and charging directly at the side of the USS Spruance like coordinated one-way ramming craft. a tactic that echoed the most hardened methods of Iran's maritime militia. And then the sky became just as dangerous. The electronic warfare system aboard the Volga Dream suddenly shifted modes and focused a high-energy beam at the two low-flying FA-18S. America's advanced AESA radar was swallowed by white noise. Guidance and sensor systems began misreading the environment. One Super Hornet reported a major flight control malfunction, slipped toward an unstable condition, and nearly went into the sea. The pilot had no choice but to deploy countermeasures and pull into an emergency climb, hoping to reset the aircraft before it was too late. The peeling the onion tactic had failed completely. The destroyer USS Spruance found itself boxed in by a swarm of one-way attack boats, forcing it to slow down and pull back to avoid direct collision. Meanwhile, the Volga Dream remained untouched, kept accelerating, and was now less than 40 nautical miles from Iran's heavily defended air defense zone. Sensing that the American formation had been thrown off balance by electronic disruption and the growing danger of impact at sea, the opposing force moved to deliver a decisive blow. At 25,000 feet, the E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft suddenly lit up the emergency channel after its radar picked up 12 intense launch signatures rising from mobile launchers along the Iranian coast, roughly 150 kilometers away. They were 12 Qadr anti-ship missiles, Iran's upgraded long-range variant, racing in fast and low like a coordinated pack. Within moments, they dropped to sea-skimming altitude, flying barely 3 meters above the waves at nearly Mach 0.9. At that height, they became extremely difficult for American long-range radar to track, hidden in the clutter of the ocean surface and cutting reaction time from minutes to only seconds. General quarters sounded across the USS Bunker Hill. The code word Vampire flooded the comms net. Instantly, the ship's Phalanx CIWS and interceptor missile systems shifted to full combat mode, throwing out walls of 20mm fire and defensive missiles to build a last-second shield around the vessel. The incoming missiles were intercepted, but the sheer pressure of the attack forced the American warship into extreme evasive maneuvers, completely breaking the original encirclement. That was the trap. Ahead, civilian merchant traffic was escaping the area. Behind, more shore-based missile launches could follow at any moment. All around, fast attack boats were closing in, ready to ram. Exploiting the gap, the Volga Dream released a thick smoke screen to blind the remaining optical sensors and surged ahead at full speed. The distance to safety was now just 20 nautical miles. If it crossed that line, Iran's S-500 air defenses and ballistic missile coverage would turn the sky into a locked gate. At that point, stopping the ship through conventional means would become nearly impossible. On the surface, tactical commanders were running out of options. So 5th Fleet Command made a final gamble: deploy SEAL Team 6. The plan was to use the darkness and confusion left behind by the missile strike, send an MH-60R Seahawk in at extremely low altitude, slip through the radar blind spot between the two formations, and insert the team directly onto the target ship to force it to stop at close range. And that brings us back to 2:14, the moment we saw at the start of the video. The gamble went wrong. The SEALs were detected. The Club K launchers hidden on the deck of the Volga Dream rose into position and locked onto the approaching aircraft. In that instant, the fate of the Special Operations Team and the entire mission was being measured in seconds. The Admiral of the 5th Fleet now understood the hard truth. Conventional firepower was no longer enough. What was needed now was not destruction, but a precisely delivered physical impact strong enough to stop the ship in place. The combat order was encoded and transmitted by extremely low-frequency ELF signal to a depth of 400 meters, where America's real hidden asset had been waiting in silence. Beneath the thermocline, carefully masked from sonar, the Virginia-class nuclear attack submarine USS Virginia had been shadowing the target for the last 4 hours. The moment the commander received the red alert signal from the SEAL team, he understood there was no time left to wait for permission from Washington. He chose to launch a single Mark 48 AD-cap heavy torpedo. But the aim was not the hull of the Volga Dream. Instead, the weapon was programmed for a point of open water exactly 10 meters beneath the ship's spinning propeller. The torpedo surged forward and triggered its proximity fuse at precisely the right moment. The PBXN-103 charge detonated, forming a massive cavitation bubble beneath the vessel. A split second later, that bubble collapsed under immense water pressure, sending a violent upward water hammer straight into the ship's stern. The effect was devastating. The rear section of the 15,000-ton vessel was thrown upward out of the water. The shock snapped the reinforced propeller shaft, jammed the rudder, and instantly stripped the ship of maneuverability. Even more important, the violent jolt knocked the deck-mounted Club K launch systems out of alignment, breaking their radar lock on the MH-60R helicopter above. The Volga Dream was no longer in control. It drifted helplessly. The SEAL team had escaped by the narrowest margin. The threat had finally been crippled, but the crisis was not over. Behind the damaged vessel, the Iranian fishing boat surged forward in a frantic attempt to recover it. And almost immediately, U.S. maritime surveillance picked up a new danger: 4 large heat signatures racing out from the nearby Bandar Abbas naval base. They were Boghammer fast attack boats of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, armed with 23mm cannons and shoulder-fired missiles, tearing across the water at nearly 80 knots. Their mission was obvious: reach the drifting Volga Dream, lock heavy tow cables onto it, and drag it into Iranian territorial waters, now less than 5 nautical miles away. If they got there first and formed a protective ring around the ship, the United States would lose its final chance. Any direct strike at that point risked hitting Iranian personnel, which could trigger a far wider confrontation. There were only 5 minutes left. The MH-60R had no choice but to climb and withdraw with the SEALs on board, pulling away before the incoming fast boats could bring anti-air fire into range. That meant the final responsibility for stopping the vessel passed to something almost invisible above the battlefield: a ghost in the upper sky, the F-35C Block 4 stealth fighter. And its pilot had just received the order to carry out the final surgical strike. The weapon selected for the final move was the AGM-158CLRASM, a long-range anti-ship missile. But this was still a massive gamble. GPS in the area remained blocked by jamming equipment left active around the target, which meant the missile could not depend on satellite guidance. It had to rely entirely on its electro-optical seeker, an onboard AI, to identify and track the right aim point on its own. And the margin for error was almost impossible. The pilot was under strict orders not to sink the ship outright. The true target was the exposed ultra-high-voltage generator compartment on the deck of the Volga Dream, the single power source feeding the Merman BN system and the cooling unit connected to the radioisotope core. That small compartment was the only point that could shut everything down without triggering a far greater catastrophe. The F-35C rolled into position and released the LRASM from 30,000 feet. The missile slipped forward in near silence, switching to thermal imaging as it descended. Ahead of it, the Boghamar boats were racing toward the drifting ship at full speed. The missile had to pass through that shrinking gap and strike a target barely 2 square meters wide on a vessel being thrown around by rough water. It was the definition of threading a needle at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. A drift of just 1 meter to the left could hit an Iranian boat and ignite a much bigger crisis. 1 meter too low, and the weapon could punch through the hull and reach the radioisotope section below, creating a contamination event no one could contain. Inside 5th Fleet Command, every eye stayed fixed on the screen as the red tracking mark dropped toward the target. In that moment, the outcome of the entire operation, and perhaps the fragile balance across the Middle East, rested on the nose of a single missile. The LRASM came down at an 80-degree angle and pierced the thin steel shell of the generator compartment on the deck of the Volga Dream. What followed was not a giant fireball. Instead, the penetrating warhead triggered a violent arc flash inside the ship's electrical system. In an instant, temperatures surged to roughly 20,000 degrees Celsius, burning through circuit boards, AI processors, and the antenna network that powered the Merman BN complex. Just like that, the heart of the billion-dollar system was reduced to scorched metal. The pressure from the electrical blast inside the enclosed compartment then ripped open the lower structure of the ship. The Volga Dream split apart and began sinking fast. Because the electrical network had been destroyed first, no activation signal ever reached the mini radioisotope core. It went down with the wreck into waters nearly 2,000 meters deep, where crushing pressure would bury the technology for good. No contamination reached the surface. Iranian speedboats circled the sinking wreck in desperation, but there was nothing they could do. The mission objective had been achieved. The skies over the Middle East remained under U.S. Navy control, but relief lasted only seconds. Before the American admiral could fully process the outcome, an urgent encrypted NSA message hit the command station. It confirmed a second Merman BN signal moving across the Syrian border. The Pentagon had already feared this possibility. Iran was never going to risk everything on a single shipment. This was only the opening round. And now one question remained. Where was the second ship?